At my retirement party, my daughter-in-law stood up in front of everyone and said, "Let's talk about all her mistakes." The room froze. My heart pounded, but I took the microphone, smiled, and said, "I think my new position speaks for itself." If this story has you hooked already, make sure to subscribe and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. My name is Linda Carter, and after 40 years of teaching, I was finally retiring. My school had organized a celebration in the community hall, and it was filled with balloons, flowers, and photos of me with my students over the years. I felt nervous but proud as I looked around the room. Colleagues I had worked with for decades were there. Former students came to hug me, and my family sat near the front table. My husband James stood proudly at my side, smiling every time someone came over to thank me for the impact I had made. My daughter Emily beamed with joy, clapping the loudest during every speech. And my son Mark tried to look relaxed, though I could see him glancing nervously at his wife, Rachel. Rachel had always been sharp-tongued and competitive. Even in family dinners, she often made comments that cut deeper than she realized. Tonight, she seemed restless, shifting in her chair, whispering under her breath during other people's speeches. I noticed, but I tried to push it aside. This was my night, and I wanted to believe nothing could spoil it. When one of my colleagues finished a heartfelt tribute about my years of teaching, Emily leaned toward me and whispered, "Mom, you deserve this. Don't let anyone ruin it." I smiled and squeezed her hand, telling myself she was right. This was supposed to be a night of gratitude, not conflict. But as I looked at Rachel's smirk across the table, a small part of me knew the peace I wanted might not last. When Rachel stood up from her seat, I thought for a moment that maybe she was going to surprise me with kind words. She walked to the microphone with that familiar, confident stride, the one that always seemed to say she owned the room. The hall grew quiet, and I saw several of my colleagues smile politely, expecting another heartfelt tribute. My chest tightened with unease, but I forced myself to stay calm. Rachel tapped the microphone, glanced at me with a small smirk, and then cleared her throat. "Well," she began, "I think we've all heard enough about Linda's accomplishments. Maybe tonight, we should also talk about her mistakes." The air shifted instantly. The light-hearted chatter disappeared, and a hush fell across the hall. I heard someone gasp quietly at the back of the room. My stomach dropped, but I held my head high, determined not to let my expression betray my feelings. Rachel smiled wider, sensing the discomfort she had stirred. "You see, everyone calls her dedicated and hardworking, but let's be honest. Linda was strict, sometimes too strict. My husband Mark and his sister Emily both grew up with rules so tight they could barely breathe." I looked over at Mark, who stared down at the floor, his jaw tense. Emily's face flushed red, and I could tell she was seconds away from jumping up to defend me. But I shook my head slightly, silently telling her to wait. Rachel continued, her voice smooth and loud enough to carry to every corner of the room. "At school, sure, she worked long hours, but she also brought that same rigidness home. Did anyone ever talk about the birthdays she missed because she was grading papers? Or the times she put her students ahead of her own kids? People love to celebrate her, but not everyone knows the full story." The words stung, not because they were entirely false, but because they were being twisted in the worst possible way. I had sacrificed, yes. I had worked late, yes. But every choice I made was to provide for my children and give them a stable future. Rachel wasn't sharing truths. She was weaponizing moments of sacrifice into accusations of failure. I could feel the audience shifting uneasily in their seats. My colleagues looked around awkwardly, unsure whether to intervene. Some of my former students frowned, as if they couldn't reconcile the teacher who inspired them with the woman Rachel was describing. Rachel glanced back at me before adding another blow. "And let's not forget the mistakes she made in her career. Not every student succeeded under her. Not every project went smoothly, but somehow, we only ever hear the good things. Maybe it's time we balance the story." Her voice dripped with satisfaction, like she was finally saying what no one else dared. The smirk never left her face, and I realized she wasn't just criticizing me, she was enjoying the humiliation. Emily suddenly stood up, unable to hold back any longer. "That's enough, Rachel," she said firmly, her voice shaking with anger. "This is supposed to be a celebration, not an attack." Rachel turned toward her with a shrug. "I'm just being honest. Everyone wants to pretend Linda is perfect, but I think people deserve to know she isn't." Emily's eyes burned with fury. "She never claimed to be perfect. She's human, and she gave her life to her work and her family. That's why we're here, to honor her, not tear her down." A murmur of agreement rippled through the room, but Rachel waved it off with a dismissive laugh. "Oh, please! You're just too blinded by loyalty to see the truth." Mark finally looked up, his face pale. "Rachel, maybe this isn't the time." His voice was soft, almost pleading, but Rachel ignored him, turning back to the microphone. "And one more thing," she added, raising her chin. "Maybe we should all stop pretending that this career of hers was flawless, because if you look close enough, you'll find plenty of and that's the truth people don't want to say out loud." Her words echoed in the hall, sharp and cruel. For a moment, I felt frozen in my chair, every pair of eyes in the room burning into me, waiting to see how I would respond. My heart pounded in my chest, and I could feel the old instinct to shrink away, to let the storm pass. But deep inside, something shifted. I realized Rachel wasn't just criticizing me. She was trying to strip me of the very dignity I had earned through decades of hard work. She wanted to turn my retirement celebration into my downfall, and if I stayed silent, she would succeed. I drew in a long breath, my hands steadying on the edge of the table. Emily's eyes were locked on me, filled with fear and anger on my behalf. James gave me a small nod, silently telling me I didn't have to take this anymore. Even Mark, torn as he was, looked at me with regret. That was the moment I knew I had to stand. I had to take the microphone, not with anger or shouting, but with the calm strength I had built over a lifetime. Rachel wanted to expose my mistakes. I would show her that those mistakes were not failures. They were proof of a life lived with courage, resilience, and purpose. I sat frozen in my chair for a moment, the sting of Rachel's words still hanging in the air. My chest rose and fell as I tried to keep my emotions steady. Part of me wanted to cry. Another part wanted to walk out of that hall and never look back. But as I looked around the room, I realized I wasn't just fighting for myself. I was fighting for the respect of my family, for the students whose lives I had touched, and for the years of work that had brought me to this moment. I thought about all the sacrifices I had made over the years. Yes, I had missed a birthday or two while grading papers. And yes, not every student I taught went on to succeed, but I had poured my heart into my career. I had stayed late to tutor kids who couldn't afford extra help. I had bought supplies with my own money when the school budget ran dry. I had written letters of recommendation that helped my students chase dreams they thought were impossible. These weren't mistakes. These were the choices that defined me, and I would not let Rachel twist them into something shameful. I pushed my chair back slowly and rose to my feet. The sound of the chair legs scraping the floor drew the eyes of every person in the room. Conversations died instantly. Rachel glanced over, the smirk still on her face, convinced she had won. Emily reached for my hand, whispering, "Mom, you don't have to do this." But I shook my head gently. I had to. With deliberate steps, I walked toward the microphone. My legs trembled at first, but with each step, my determination grew stronger. I could see the worry in James's eyes as he watched me, but I also saw pride there, the same pride he had shown on the day I earned my teaching award years ago. When I reached the microphone, Rachel tried to hand it to me with an almost mocking smile. "Go ahead," she said under her breath. "Defend yourself." I took it calmly, my fingers firm on the metal handle. I turned to face the room. Rows of eyes stared back at me, friends, colleagues, students, neighbors, all waiting to see how I would respond. The silence was thick, but it wasn't empty. It was expectant. I took a deep breath and steadied my voice. "Rachel wants to talk about mistakes," I began, my tone calm and even. "And she's right about one thing. I have made plenty of them." A murmur rippled through the audience, but I raised my hand slightly, keeping their attention. "I have missed birthdays. I have missed dinners. I have worked long nights and early mornings. Not every lesson I taught landed the way I wanted, and not every student found the success they deserved. But those mistakes, those sacrifices, they were part of what built this career, part of what shaped who I am today. and I would not erase a single one of them. I looked directly at Rachel then, and for the first time, her smirk faltered. Her eyes darted toward the audience, realizing she no longer controlled the narrative. I didn't dedicate 4 decades of my life to education because it was easy. I did it because I believed every child deserved someone who would fight for them, even if it meant giving up pieces of myself along the way. And tonight, standing here at my retirement, I see faces in this room who prove that the sacrifices were worth it. I noticed one of my former students wiping tears from her eyes. A colleague nodded firmly, and another began to clap softly before stopping, waiting to see if I would continue. I took another breath, my confidence building. Rachel wanted to expose my flaws, but she doesn't understand that those flaws are part of the journey. They don't erase the accomplishments. They highlight the strength it takes to keep moving forward despite them. I held the microphone a little tighter and said, "So yes, let's talk about mistakes. Because every mistake I made led me to the position I stand in today. And I think that speaks louder than any criticism ever could." The hall was completely still, but I could feel the shift. My words had changed the energy in the room. Rachel's attempt to tear me down had only given me the chance to rise higher. I glanced toward my family. Emily's eyes glistened with pride. James gave me a small nod of encouragement, and even Mark looked conflicted. Shame etched across his face as he glanced between me and his wife. In that moment, I knew the turning point had arrived. I wasn't going to let Rachel define my legacy with her bitterness. I would define it myself, with the truth of who I was and what I had accomplished. The microphone felt heavier in my hands than I expected, but the weight gave me strength. I let the silence stretch for a moment before I spoke again, allowing everyone to absorb the words I had already shared. Then, with a steady smile, I leaned forward and said, "At the end of the day, I don't need to defend myself. My career, my family, and the life I've built speak louder than any criticism. And I think my new position speaks for itself." As soon as the words left my mouth, the room erupted in applause. It wasn't polite or hesitant. It was a wave of clapping, cheers, and even a few whistles. My colleagues stood to their feet. Former students clapped with tears in their eyes, and friends smiled brightly as if they had been waiting for me to claim my moment. The sound filled every corner of the hall, drowning out the sting of Rachel's earlier words. I looked over at her, and for the first time that evening, she looked unsettled. The smirk was gone. She shifted uncomfortably, glancing at Mark, as though hoping for his support. But he sat frozen, his expression caught somewhere between shame and regret. He avoided her eyes, and I could see the tension in his shoulders. Emily was on her feet before the applause even died down. She hugged me tightly, whispering in my ear, "Mom, you were perfect. You showed everyone who you really are." James followed, wrapping his arm around me and nodding proudly. "You didn't just defend yourself," he said softly. "You reminded them why you deserve every bit of this celebration." The applause finally softened, and people began calling out words of encouragement. "We love you, Mrs. Carter," one of my former students shouted from the back. "You changed my life." Another colleague added, 40 years of dedication, that's no mistake. That's greatness." Rachel's face flushed red as whispers spread among the guests. She had tried to paint me as flawed, but instead, she had handed me the stage to show the truth. Her attempt to humiliate me had only made my triumph more powerful. She crossed her arms tightly, muttering under her breath, but no one paid her attention anymore. The spotlight was no longer hers to control. I raised my hand slightly to quiet the room, and when the noise subsided, I spoke again. "I want to thank every person here for being part of my journey. Teaching was never just a job to me. It was my calling. And yes, I stumbled, I struggled, and I sacrificed. But the proof of my life's work is standing right here in this room, in every student who came back tonight, in every colleague who stood by me, and in the family I raised with love. That is what I choose to celebrate." The crowd clapped again, this time softer, more emotional. I could see tears in the eyes of people I had taught decades ago. The energy in the hall had shifted completely. Where there had once been tension and awkwardness, there was now warmth, unity, and pride. Rachel tried once more to interject. "You're just making yourself look good," she snapped. her voice breaking. "You fooled everyone into thinking you're some kind of saint." But before I could even answer, a colleague from the front row stood up and said firmly, "That's enough. Tonight is about honoring Linda, not tearing her down." Others murmured in agreement, and Rachel sank back into her seat, silenced by the room itself. Mark finally spoke, his voice low and strained. "Rachel, stop. You've done enough." His words seemed to sting her more than anything I had said. She turned her face away, refusing to meet his eyes. I looked around the hall, my heart swelling with gratitude. This was the moment I had feared, that my mistakes would overshadow my achievements. But instead, it had become the moment that proved mistakes are part of every great story. They don't erase the successes. They highlight the resilience behind them. I held the microphone one last time and said, "We all make mistakes. I made mine, and I'll own them. But tonight isn't about what went wrong. It's about what we built together, what we achieved, and the memories we carry forward. That is the real legacy I leave behind." The hall thundered with applause again, louder than before. I handed the microphone back to the organizer, and as I returned to my seat, I felt lighter than I had in years. Rachel sat silently, her arms crossed, her face pale with embarrassment. But I didn't need to look at her anymore. I had reclaimed my dignity, and no one could take it away. That night, I walked out of the hall with my family at my side. The cool evening air hit my face, and I smiled to myself. Rachel's words had started as daggers, but they ended as stepping stones. And in the end, the truth had spoken louder than anything she could have said. When the party ended, and the last of the guests hugged me goodbye, I felt a wave of peace wash over me. The same hall that had been filled with tension only hours before now seemed warmer, brighter, and lighter. My colleagues left with smiles, my former students left with gratitude, and my family, though shaken by Rachel's behavior, walked away with a deeper understanding of what the night had really meant. James stayed close to me as we gathered the last of the flowers and cards. "Linda," he said quietly, "you handled yourself better than anyone else could have. You didn't let anger win, and you didn't let her control your story. You made sure everyone saw the real you." His words warmed me more than he realized. For years, I had leaned on him in the quiet moments when I doubted myself, and hearing his pride now meant everything. Emily rushed to my side, still bubbling with emotion. "Mom, I wanted to scream at her. I wanted to defend you so badly, but the way you stood there and spoke, it was so much stronger than anything I could have said. You showed me that dignity is the most powerful answer." She hugged me so tightly, I thought my ribs might ache, but I didn't mind. That hug told me that my daughter had seen me not just as her mother, but as her role model. Mark lingered nearby, clearly torn between loyalty to his wife and shame at her actions. He finally approached me, his eyes downcast. "Mom, I'm sorry. I didn't know she would do that. I should have stopped her." His voice cracked, and I saw the guilt etched into his face. I placed a hand on his arm and said gently, "Mark, this isn't about you. You can't control someone else's choices, but you can control what you do next." He nodded slowly, and I hoped my words would sink in. Rachel kept her distance. She stood near the doors, arms crossed, her expression closed off. She didn't apologize, not then and not later, but I noticed how quiet she had become after the climax of the night. For once, her voice didn't dominate the room. I didn't need her apology to know I had won. The truth had spoken louder than her accusations ever could. When we finally left the hall, stepping into the cool night air, I felt lighter. The stars dotted the sky, and for the first time in a long while, I felt that my years of work had truly come full circle. Retirement had once felt frightening, like stepping into a future without purpose. But that night reminded me that my purpose was never tied to a paycheck. It was tied to the lives I had touched, the family I had raised, and the strength I had carried through every storm. Over the next few days, messages poured in. Students wrote long notes telling me how I had changed their lives. Parents thanked me for the patience and care I had shown their children. Colleagues dropped by with flowers and meals, saying how proud they were of how I had handled myself. Even neighbors who heard about the party came over to congratulate me. Every message, every hug, every smile reminded me that Rachel's attempt to humiliate me had only elevated me in the eyes of others. Inside myself, the lesson became clear. People will always find reasons to criticize, to point out flaws, to try to tear others down. Sometimes it comes from strangers, and sometimes, painfully, it comes from family. But mistakes and imperfections are not signs of failure. They are proof of effort, growth, and resilience. My daughter-in-law had wanted to use my mistakes as weapons, but I had turned them into a shield, and that shield was stronger than her bitterness. I also realized that silence is not always strength. There are moments when you have to stand and speak your truth, not with anger, but with calm conviction. That night taught me that dignity isn't about avoiding conflict. It's about facing it without losing yourself. As the days passed, the memory of Rachel's words faded, but the memory of the applause, the pride in my children's eyes, and the gratitude of my students stayed with me. That was the legacy I wanted to carry into retirement. Not perfection, but impact. Not flawlessness, but strength. Looking back now, I wouldn't erase the confrontation. In some strange way, it gave me closure. It reminded me of who I was and who I had become. And as I step into this new chapter of my life, I carry that strength with me, ready to embrace whatever comes next. Because in the end, my retirement wasn't overshadowed by Rachel's bitterness. It was defined by my resilience. And that is the story I will carry forward, not just for myself, but for anyone who has ever been torn down when they should have been celebrated. If this story left you inspired, don't forget to subscribe and share in the comments where you're watching from. I'd love to hear your thoughts.